She once stood beneath the harshest lights Hollywood could offer, a face carved into collective memory, a name spoken as if it were synonymous with beauty itself. To the world, she was untouchable. To the cameras, she was radiant. But behind the polished stills and the frozen smiles, there has always been another story moving quietly in the background, one the audience was never meant to see. It is the story of a woman who learned very early that love could vanish without warning, and that survival sometimes demands silence more than strength. There are moments in life when the noise falls away so completely that even breathing feels loud. For Demi Moore, one of those moments came long after fame had done its work, long after applause had shaped her identity and then slipped through her fingers. The headlines would later frame it as a tragic diagnosis, a quiet farewell, a woman preparing to disappear from the world that once adored her. But the truth, as it often is, lives in the spaces between those words. It lives in the pauses, in the weight of memory, in the exhaustion of having spent decades proving that she deserved to exist. Once hailed as the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, Demi Moore was not born into warmth or certainty. Her earliest memories were not of protection, but of instability, of moving from place to place, of learning to read moods before learning to read books. Long before she understood fame, she understood fear. Long before she understood romance, she understood abandonment. That understanding did not fade with success. It followed her into every room, every relationship, every role she ever played. When audiences fell in love with her on screen, especially in moments that came to symbolize devotion and tenderness, they saw a fantasy made flesh. What they could not see was the quiet contradiction behind it. The woman who could perform love flawlessly while still feeling untouched by it in real life. The more the world praised her, the more distant she felt from herself, as if admiration were something happening to someone else entirely. Now, at an age when Hollywood rarely offers women patience or forgiveness, Demi Moore stands at a different threshold. The strength that once carried her through relentless schedules and impossible expectations has softened into something more fragile, more honest. The body that once endured extreme transformations, punishing discipline and constant scrutiny, has begun to speak in quieter but firmer ways. Fatigue no longer hides behind glamour. Pain no longer waits politely for the cameras to turn away. Those close to her have described a woman who moves more slowly now, who listens more than she speaks, who spends long stretches in reflection rather than performance. There is no dramatic announcement, no grand declaration of retreat. Instead, there is a gradual withdrawal, almost imperceptible, like the tide pulling back before dawn. It is not the withdrawal of defeat, but of someone who has learned that survival does not always look like endurance. Sometimes it looks like letting go. For years, Demi Moore built her life around being enough for others. Enough for an industry that thrives on replacement. Enough for partners who came and went. Enough for an audience that demanded constant reinvention without ever asking how much it cost. That effort left marks no makeup could cover. It left a weariness that no award could cure. And eventually, it led to a moment when the question was no longer how to keep going, but why. The idea of saying goodbye does not always mean death. Sometimes it means stepping away from an identity that has become too heavy to carry. Sometimes it means acknowledging that the version of you the world loved is not the version you need to survive. In that sense, Demi Moore's story is not about disappearance, but about a reckoning. A reckoning with a lifetime spent chasing validation and the slow realization that being seen is not the same as being whole. There is a particular loneliness reserved for those who are loved by millions but known by few. It is a loneliness that grows sharper with age, especially when the spotlight dims and the silence grows louder. Demi Moore has lived inside that loneliness for decades, often masking it with ambition, with beauty, with resilience that bordered on self-erasure. Now, that loneliness has forced a different kind of honesty, one that does not perform, one that does not ask to be admired. As the world speculates about diagnoses and farewells, what remains undeniable is this: Demi Moore is no longer running. She is no longer trying to outrun her past or outshine her pain. Whatever lies ahead, whether it is recovery, retreat, or simply rest, it begins with an acceptance she once denied herself. The acceptance that existing does not require permission. That worth does not depend on applause. That sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stop pretending they are unbreakable. This story does not open with an ending. It opens with a pause, a deep breath taken by someone who has finally allowed herself to feel how tired she is and how much she has survived. It is in that pause that the real story begins. Before the world learned to pronounce her name with awe, before cameras traced every line of her face, Demi Moore learned how to disappear. Not physically, but emotionally. As a child, she mastered the art of shrinking herself, of becoming quiet enough to avoid conflict, invisible enough to survive chaos. Her early life unfolded in fragments, never rooted, never stable. Home was not a place, but a temporary arrangement, one that could collapse without warning. Adults came and went. Promises were made and broken. And love, the kind that stays, was always just out of reach. She was born into uncertainty, raised inside the unpredictable rhythms of addiction and instability. Her mother was beautiful, magnetic, and deeply unwell, battling demons that left little room for tenderness. Alcohol dictated moods, decisions, and silences. For a child, there was no way to understand why comfort sometimes arrived and sometimes vanished, why affection could turn cold in an instant. Demi learned early that safety was conditional, that being loved meant being useful, pleasing, or silent. That lesson would follow her into adulthood, shaping the choices she did not yet know she was making. School offered no refuge. Constant moving made friendships temporary and trust fragile. Just as she began to feel seen, it was time to leave again. Each goodbye reinforced the same belief, that nothing stays, that attachment is dangerous, that expecting care only leads to disappointment. She did not dream of becoming famous. She dreamed of escaping. Escape became her first ambition, long before acting ever entered the picture. As a teenager, she stepped into adulthood abruptly, without guidance or protection. Independence came not as freedom, but as necessity. She worked where she could, slept where she could, and learned to rely only on herself. The world taught her that vulnerability invited harm, so she hardened. That hardness would later be mistaken for confidence, for strength, for ambition. In truth, it was armor. When she entered the world of modeling and then acting, Hollywood felt like another universe. Bright, loud, intoxicating. It rewarded what her childhood had trained her to offer: adaptability, discipline, the ability to read a room and give it what it wanted. She could become whoever was required. The industry praised her for it. Casting directors admired her intensity. Photographers loved the tension in her eyes, the sense that something lived beneath the surface. What they were seeing was not mystery. It was history. Early success came quickly, but it did not bring peace. Each achievement raised the stakes. Each role confirmed a dangerous idea, that her value depended on performance. She pushed herself relentlessly, taking on demanding projects, reshaping her body, her image, her voice, all in service of staying relevant, staying wanted. Hollywood applauded her work ethic. Few asked what it cost. As her career rose, her personal life mirrored familiar patterns. She gravitated toward relationships that promised security but carried instability beneath the surface. Love felt intense, consuming, urgent. The kind of love that feels like salvation at first and later reveals itself as repetition. She gave everything, believing that if she loved hard enough, stayed loyal enough, endured quietly enough, she could finally earn permanence. But permanence never came. Marriage offered the illusion of stability, a shared last name, a public declaration that she belonged to someone. For a while, it felt like a victory over her past. Yet even there, old fears whispered. Fear of abandonment. Fear of being replaced. Fear that if she stopped trying, stopped proving, she would be left behind once more. Those fears shaped her behavior in ways she did not yet recognize. She loved with intensity that bordered on self-erasure. Motherhood changed her in ways both profound and painful. Her children became her anchor, her purpose, her proof that she could give what she never received. But motherhood also reopened old wounds. The fear of failing them, of repeating history, of losing them the way she once felt lost herself, lived constantly beneath the surface. She tried to be everything at once, nurturing, strong, present, perfect. Perfection, she believed, was the only safeguard against loss. All the while, the public saw something else entirely. A woman in control, a feminist icon, a symbol of power and independence. Someone who demanded equal pay, who challenged norms, who refused to be small. That image was not false, but it was incomplete. Strength, in her case, had been built on survival, not serenity. It functioned, but it did not heal. Inside, the exhaustion accumulated quietly. Years of suppressing pain, of performing resilience, of ignoring the body's warnings began to take their toll. She learned to override hunger, sleep, and rest. She learned to treat discomfort as weakness. The same discipline that fueled her success also eroded her sense of self. When the roles slowed, when the relationships fractured, when the applause faded, she was left facing a question she had avoided her entire life. Who am I when no one is watching? This was the context in which later crises would emerge. Not sudden, not inexplicable, but deeply rooted. The breakdowns that followed were not isolated incidents. They were the natural consequence of a life lived in constant defense, of a woman who had never been allowed to be soft without consequence. Understanding her past is essential to understanding her collapse. It was not failure. It was fatigue. By the time the world began to notice the cracks, they had been there for decades. What looked like a sudden unraveling was in fact a long-delayed reckoning. Demi Moore did not fall because she was weak. She fell because she had been strong for too long without rest, without safety, without unconditional love. And that truth, uncomfortable as it is, reframes everything that comes next. The moment everything began to unravel did not arrive with drama or warning. There was no single night, no single headline, no single betrayal that could explain what followed. It came quietly, layered beneath exhaustion, heartbreak, and a lifetime of unresolved fear. For Demi Moore, the present finally collided with the past, and the collision was merciless. From the outside, her life still appeared enviable. She had survived Hollywood, raised 3 daughters, and remained a recognizable name long after many of her contemporaries had faded. Yet inside, something had already begun to fracture. The end of her marriage had not merely broken her heart. It had stripped away the last illusion she clung to, the belief that love, if fought for hard enough, could be secured. When that belief collapsed, it left behind a silence she did not know how to fill. She tried to outrun it. Work became refuge again, just as it had decades earlier. She accepted roles that demanded transformation, intensity, physical punishment. She reshaped herself relentlessly, training harder, dieting more aggressively, pushing her body beyond what it was willing to give. To the public, this looked like discipline, like strength, like commitment. To those close to her, it looked like desperation wearing the mask of ambition. Then came the relationship that seemed to rewrite the narrative. Younger, vibrant, full of laughter and attention, he represented everything she feared she was losing. With him, she felt visible again, desired again, alive in a way she had not felt in years. For a time, it was intoxicating. She laughed more easily. She stepped back into the light. The world watched with fascination, sometimes admiration, often cruelty. Age became a weapon in the commentary, a reminder that Hollywood rarely forgives women for growing older. What the cameras did not capture was how much she needed that relationship to work. It was not simply romance. It was validation, proof that she had not aged out of love. that she was still worthy of being chosen. The fear beneath it was old and familiar. If this failed, it would confirm everything she had always believed about herself. That fear shaped her behavior, her expectations, her willingness to ignore warning signs. As a relationship strained, so did she. Sleep became elusive. Food became an enemy. Medication crept from necessity into dependence. Nights stretched long and restless, filled with thoughts she could not silence. The more she tried to control her life, her body, her image, the more control slipped away. Friends noticed the change. There were moments when her presence felt distant, when conversations drifted past her as if she were underwater. The breaking point did not announce itself as such. It arrived in the middle of what should have been an ordinary gathering, surrounded by familiar faces. Her body simply gave up. When she collapsed, it was not only physical exhaustion that carried her to the floor. It was years of unprocessed trauma, grief, and self-denial demanding attention at once. The ambulance ride, the hospital lights, the quiet panic, all unfolded in a blur she would later struggle to remember. Doctors spoke of severe exhaustion, of the toll taken by stress, deprivation, and substance misuse. The language was clinical, cautious, but the truth was heavier. This was a complete breakdown, not of character, but of endurance. She had reached the limit of how much pain a person can carry without being held. The media response was immediate and merciless. Headlines reduced complexity to spectacle. Speculation replaced compassion. Her suffering became content, dissected and consumed by strangers. Some framed it as a scandal, others as a cautionary tale about vanity and age. Few acknowledged the deeper reality, that this was a woman collapsing under the weight of a lifetime spent proving she deserved to exist. In the days that followed, she withdrew completely. Projects were canceled. Public appearances vanished. Phone calls went unanswered. Rumors filled the vacuum. Rehab, isolation, retreat. The truth was simpler and harder. She was trying to survive. Each morning became a negotiation with her own body, her own mind. Breathing required effort. Existing required intention. She confronted something she had avoided her entire life. The reality that strength alone would not save her. The coping mechanisms that once protected her had become liabilities. Silence, endurance, self-denial, all the tools she learned as a child, now threatened to destroy her. For the first time, she could not push through. She could not perform wellness. She had to stop. Therapy began not as a revelation, but as resistance. Speaking the truth felt dangerous. Naming pain made it real. Yet slowly, session by session, memory by memory, she began to untangle the narrative she had carried for decades. She spoke of childhood fear, of abandonment, of the belief that love must be earned through suffering. Each admission was exhausting, but also grounding. For the first time, her pain was witnessed without being judged or monetized. Recovery was not linear. There were setbacks, days when progress felt imaginary, nights when old thoughts returned uninvited. But something subtle shifted. The urgency to be admired faded. The obsession with control softened. She began to notice small things again. Sunlight through a window, the sound of her own breath, the quiet presence of her daughters when they slowly re-entered her life. Rebuilding those relationships required humility. She listened more than she spoke. She accepted anger without defending herself. She allowed herself to be imperfect in front of the people who mattered most. That acceptance was unfamiliar and terrifying, but it was also healing. For the first time, love was not something she had to perform. What the public labeled as a tragic diagnosis was, in reality, a confrontation with truth. There was no single illness to name, no simple villain to blame. There was only a woman forced to face the cost of a lifetime spent surviving instead of living. The collapse was not the end of her story. It was the moment the story finally demanded honesty. And in that honesty, something new began to take shape. Not a return to who she was, but the possibility of becoming someone she had never been allowed to be. someone who did not confuse endurance with worth, someone who could exist without applause. The aftermath did not arrive with relief. It arrived with silence, heavy and unfamiliar. When the noise of the crisis faded, when the headlines moved on and the phones stopped ringing, what remained was a woman sitting alone with the consequences of a life pushed beyond its limits. For Demi Moore, survival did not feel like triumph. It felt like standing in the wreckage, trying to understand what had been lost and what could never be rebuilt in the same way again. The most immediate impact was physical. Her body, once treated as an instrument to be disciplined and reshaped at will, demanded care instead of control. Recovery was slow, frustrating, humbling. Energy returned in fragments. Concentration wavered. There were days when even simple routines felt overwhelming. The illusion of invincibility, carefully maintained for decades, had shattered. In its place was a fragile awareness that she was not exempt from limits, that strength could no longer be measured by endurance alone. Emotionally, the reckoning cut deeper. Without work to anchor her identity, without public admiration to fill the silence, she was confronted by a question she had avoided for most of her life. Who am I when I am no longer needed? The answer did not come easily. There was grief for the woman she had been, for the role she might never play again, for the version of herself that believed love could be secured through sacrifice. Letting go of those beliefs felt like another kind of loss. Her absence from the public eye fueled speculation, but inside her world, the consequences were quieter and more personal. Friendships shifted. Some relationships faded without explanation, unable to exist outside the context of success and visibility. Others deepened unexpectedly, grounded not in image but in shared vulnerability. She learned, sometimes painfully, that not everyone who celebrates you is prepared to sit with you in stillness. The relationship with her children became both a source of comfort and confrontation. They returned cautiously, carrying their own memories, their own unspoken resentments. Being present for them required a kind of honesty she had never practiced. She could no longer hide behind busyness or perfection. She had to listen, to acknowledge the ways her fears and absences had affected them. That process was slow and often uncomfortable, but it reshaped their bond. Love, she discovered, could survive without control. Professionally, the consequences were undeniable. Hollywood is not patient with pauses, especially when taken by women. Opportunities diminished. Scripts stopped arriving. The industry that once celebrated her resilience quietly moved on. There was a time when this realization would have devastated her. Now, it provoked something closer to resignation than despair. The loss of relevance hurt, but it no longer defined her worth in the way it once had. Public perception also shifted. The narrative surrounding her became cautionary, sometimes cruel. Aging, once invisible when paired with success, became a point of fixation. Her collapse was framed as evidence of decline rather than a symptom of long, ignored pain. That framing carried weight. It reinforced the message that women are expected to endure endlessly and disappear quietly when they cannot. Understanding that dynamic did not erase the hurt, but it contextualized it. There were also quieter losses, the daily rituals that no longer felt possible, the social ease she once navigated instinctively, the confidence to walk into any room without hesitation. Recovery required rebuilding those instincts from the ground up. She learned to move through the world differently, with less certainty but more awareness. Each step forward was tentative, uncelebrated, deeply personal. Yet within these consequences, something unexpected emerged. Space. Without the constant pressure to perform, she discovered moments of genuine stillness. She began to notice what had always been drowned out by urgency. The rhythm of her own breathing, the comfort of routine, the relief of saying no without apology. These were small victories, invisible to the world, but they mattered. The collapse also altered how she understood success. Achievement, once measured in box office numbers and public admiration, lost its authority. Fulfillment became quieter, less visible. A morning without dread. A conversation without pretense. An evening spent alone without feeling abandoned. These experiences did not make headlines, but they reshaped her sense of self. The consequences extended beyond her own life. Her story became a mirror for others, especially women who recognized themselves in her exhaustion. Though she did not seek the role of symbol, it followed her nonetheless. In choosing recovery over performance, she challenged a culture that equates worth with productivity and silence with strength. That challenge was subtle, but significant. What remained after the fallout was not clarity, but honesty. She did not emerge healed in any dramatic sense. She emerged aware of the cost of her coping mechanisms, aware of the fragility beneath her resilience, aware that survival without self-compassion is simply another form of harm. The consequences of her collapse will never fully disappear. They live in her body, in her relationships, in the opportunities that passed her by. But they also marked an ending. The end of a life lived entirely in defense. What followed was uncertain, slower, less defined. Yet within that uncertainty lay something she had never known before. The possibility of existing without armor. Do you want me to continue to the next part, or would you like to adjust the direction before moving forward? There are stories that the public consumes easily because they fit into familiar shapes. Rise, fall, redemption. A scandal, a comeback, a neat lesson at the end. But the truths that change a person's life rarely unfold that cleanly. They live in small rooms, in unshared conversations, in nights where no one is watching. For Demi Moore, the most meaningful chapters of recovery were not the ones captured by cameras. They were the ones that happened quietly, almost invisibly, while the world assumed she had disappeared. In the months after her collapse, mornings became the hardest, not because she feared the day, but because waking up meant facing herself without distractions. She could no longer hide behind schedules or obligations. She could no longer sprint through discomfort. She had to sit with it. Some days she would wake and feel the familiar surge of panic, the reflexive belief that something was about to go wrong. That belief had lived inside her since childhood, a constant readiness for catastrophe. Healing required more than rest. It required retraining her nervous system, teaching her body that calm was possible. She began to write again, not as an author seeking an audience, but as someone trying to survive her own thoughts. At first, the pages were sparse, almost embarrassed, a few lines about fatigue, fear, and the strange emptiness that comes when you stop performing. Then the writing deepened. Names appeared. Memories resurfaced. She described moments she had never allowed herself to articulate, because putting them into words made them undeniable. The act of writing became a form of witnessing, a way of telling the truth when she could not yet say it aloud. Those close to her noticed changes that were small but profound. She stopped trying to control every room she entered. She allowed silence without rushing to fill it. She listened with her whole body, as if she were learning for the first time what it meant to be present. A friend later described her as softer, not weaker, but less armored, less concerned with image, more concerned with what felt real. That shift was not cosmetic. It was the consequence of finally understanding that her old version of strength had almost killed her. There were also difficult reckonings with the people she loved most. Healing did not simply mean repairing herself. It meant acknowledging how her pain had spilled outward. With her daughters, the process was delicate. Love existed, but so did wounds. She began to show up differently, not as the flawless mother trying to compensate for her own childhood, but as a human being who could admit fear and failure. That honesty changed the dynamic. When a mother stops performing perfection, children often feel safer telling the truth. Some of the most intimate moments of her recovery were unremarkable from the outside. Cooking simple meals, walking without headphones, sitting with her dogs in quiet sunlight. It sounds small, almost mundane, but for someone whose life had been dominated by chaos and constant intensity, these routines were revolutionary. They were proof that she could exist without crisis. that she did not have to earn peace through suffering. She also began to remove things from her life that once felt essential. Not just physical possessions, but patterns. She stepped away from environments that fed her insecurity. She reduced contact with people who only knew how to relate to her through fame. The boundaries were not dramatic. They were quiet, firm decisions made without explanation. For a woman who had spent much of her life terrified of being abandoned, choosing distance was an act of power. During therapy, she confronted the deepest thread running through her story, the belief that love must be earned. She traced it back to childhood, to a household where affection was unpredictable and safety was conditional. She recognized how that belief had shaped everything. The marriages she clung to, the roles she pursued, the relentless self-discipline, the desperation to be enough. Understanding this did not erase the pain, but it gave it a map. Pain is more bearable when it has context, when it can be named. There were nights when she still struggled. Loneliness did not vanish simply because she began healing. Some evenings she would sit with the ache of old memories, feeling the weight of years she could not reclaim. Yet even in those moments, something had changed. She did not reach for escape in the same way. She did not try to numb everything immediately. She learned to stay with discomfort, not because she enjoyed it, but because she understood that avoidance had been her undoing. Her decision to publish her memoir was not simply a career move. It was a statement, a refusal to let others tell her story for her. In choosing to speak openly about addiction, trauma, and collapse, she took control of her narrative in a way Hollywood rarely allows women. But the most important part was not the publicity. It was what came before it, the private work that made it possible. The writing was the result of hundreds of hours of self-confrontation, of moments when she chose honesty over image. There's a particular courage in telling the truth after you've been reduced to an image for decades. It means accepting that some people will misunderstand you, that some will weaponize your vulnerability, that compassion is never guaranteed. Yet she chose to speak anyway. Not loudly, not defiantly, but steadily, as if she had finally understood that she did not need permission to exist as a whole person. In quieter spaces, she began to engage with causes related to mental health and recovery, not as a celebrity lending her name, but as someone who understood despair from the inside. She did not position herself as an expert. She spoke as a survivor. That distinction mattered. It shifted the tone from performance to authenticity. These were the stories that never made the loudest headlines, the slow mornings, the difficult conversations, the private pages filled with fear and forgiveness, the choice to live without constant validation. They are not glamorous, but they are the most human part of her journey. They reveal something the public often forgets. Redemption is not a moment. It is 1,000 quiet decisions made when no one is applauding. Over time, the question surrounding Demi Moore's life shifted. It was no longer about how much she had endured, nor how far she had fallen, but about what remained after survival was no longer the goal. When the urgency faded and the noise receded, what was left was a quieter, more difficult inquiry. What does a life mean once it is no longer driven by fear? What is the legacy of a woman who spent decades being defined by beauty, power, and resilience, only to discover that none of those things guaranteed peace? Her career, viewed from a distance, reads like a series of firsts and defiance. She challenged an industry that paid women less and expected them to age invisibly. She took roles that unsettled audiences, that asked uncomfortable questions about desire, control, and worth. For a generation, she embodied a version of strength that looked unbreakable. That image mattered. It opened doors for others. It disrupted assumptions. Yet the legacy she would come to value most had little to do with box office numbers or cultural milestones. What endured was the honesty that followed the collapse. In stepping away from the performance of perfection, she revealed something far more radical: vulnerability, not as a spectacle, but as a practice. She allowed the world to see a woman who did not have answers neatly arranged, who did not emerge from pain transformed into something flawless, but who continued living anyway. In a culture that celebrates triumph and hides fragility, that visibility carried weight. Her story reframed the meaning of strength. For years, strength had meant pushing through, staying silent, absorbing damage without complaint. It had meant discipline, control, and relentless self-monitoring. Later, strength came to mean something else entirely. Asking for help, setting boundaries, resting without guilt, telling the truth even when it threatened her image. This shift was not dramatic, but it was profound. It suggested that resilience without compassion is unsustainable, and that endurance alone is not a virtue. There's a particular resonance in this evolution for women who have lived under similar pressures. Women taught to equate worth with usefulness. Women who learned early that being loved required effort, sacrifice, and self-erasure. Demi Moore's later years offered a different narrative, one that acknowledged ambition without glorifying self-destruction, one that recognized success while refusing to let it define identity. That refusal became its own form of legacy. Her relationship with aging also transformed. Where once aging felt like a threat, a confirmation of disposability, it became a teacher. Age stripped away illusions she could no longer maintain. It narrowed her focus. It clarified her values. She stopped competing with younger versions of herself and began honoring the woman she had become. This was not resignation. It was acceptance. Acceptance that beauty changes, relevance shifts, and meaning deepens when a need to impress fades. The legacy she carries now is quieter, but perhaps more enduring. It lives in conversations about mental health that no longer rely on euphemism, in the willingness to speak about addiction without shame, in a normalization of collapse as a signal rather than a failure. By sharing her story without softening its edges, she contributed to a broader understanding of how trauma echoes across decades and how healing rarely looks the way we expect. Her influence also exists in what she chose not to do. She did not rush back into the spotlight to prove recovery. She did not frame healing as a triumphant return. She allowed herself to remain undefined, to live without constant explanation. In an industry that demands narrative control, that refusal to package her life was itself a statement. It suggested that a person does not owe the world a performance of wellness. The lessons embedded in her journey are not prescriptive. They do not offer simple solutions or guarantees. Instead, they invite reflection. What would it mean to stop earning your right to exist? What would change if rest were not something you had to justify? What if being enough were not a goal, but a starting point? These questions linger not because they are easily answered, but because they challenge deeply ingrained beliefs. Her story also complicates the idea of legacy itself. Legacy is often framed as what we leave behind for others to admire. In her case, legacy became about what she reclaimed for herself. Time, presence, agency, the ability to choose how she lives rather than how she is perceived. That reclamation does not erase the pain of the past, but it changes its meaning. Pain becomes part of a larger narrative, not the defining chapter. In the end, Demi Moore's legacy is not a single image or achievement. It is a process, a movement away from survival toward truth, away from performance toward presence, away from fear towards self-recognition. It is the legacy of a woman who learned, late but decisively, that life does not ask us to be flawless. It asks us to be real. And sometimes, being real is the bravest act of all. There's a quiet moment that comes after every long journey, when the road no longer asks you to keep moving and silence stops feeling like an enemy. For Demi Moore, that moment did not arrive as a grand revelation or a public declaration. It arrived slowly, almost unnoticed, in ordinary days that no longer demanded she prove anything to anyone. The urgency that once ruled her life softened into something gentler, something that allowed her to remain exactly where she was without fear of disappearance. Looking back, it is tempting to frame her story as a victory over suffering, a neat arc that leads from pain to peace. But life rarely resolves itself so cleanly. What she gained was not the erasure of wounds, but a different relationship with them. They no longer defined her. They no longer dictated her worth. They became part of her history, acknowledged without being worshipped, remembered without being relived. She learned to live at a pace that would once have terrified her. Mornings without urgency, afternoons without obligation, evenings that did not demand distraction. In these quiet stretches, she discovered a form of happiness that had nothing to do with recognition. Happiness that did not spike or crash, but settled gently into the background of her days. It was unfamiliar at first, almost suspicious, but over time it proved steady. Her connection to the world shifted as well. She no longer sought validation through applause or headlines. Instead, she found meaning in presence, in listening, in being available to her children not as an icon or a protector, but as a mother who could be honest about her own limits. That honesty created space for real connection, the kind built on mutual recognition rather than expectation. The public, meanwhile, continued to speculate. Some asked why she no longer chased the spotlight. Others assumed she had been left behind by an industry that rarely waits. But these interpretations missed the point. Leaving the spotlight was not a loss. It was a choice, a deliberate step away from a life that demanded constant self-surveillance. In stepping back, she reclaimed something far more valuable than relevance. She reclaimed agency. Her story, when viewed in full, resists simple moral lessons. It does not promise that pain leads to wisdom, or that suffering is a prerequisite for depth. Instead, it offers a quieter truth, that ignoring pain only delays its reckoning. That strength without self-compassion becomes another form of harm. That healing is not about becoming someone new, but about finally allowing yourself to be who you are. For those who see themselves reflected in her journey, the resonance is understandable. Many people live with the belief that survival requires constant effort, that rest must be earned, that love depends on performance. Her life challenges those beliefs not through slogans, but through lived experience. It shows the cost of living that way and the possibility of choosing differently even later than you planned. Today, her life looks smaller from the outside. Fewer appearances, fewer declarations, less noise. But inside that smaller life is something expansive. Space to breathe, space to think, space to exist without fear of abandonment. These are not trivial gains. They are foundational. They're the kind of victories that cannot be taken away by time or opinion. If there is a final message embedded in her story, it is not about fame, beauty, or even resilience. It is about permission. Permission to stop chasing what hurts you. Permission to let go of identities that no longer fit. Permission to exist without justification. In a world that constantly demands more, choosing less can be an act of courage. Her journey does not end with certainty. There is no promise that life will remain calm, or that pain will never return. But there is something steadier now, an understanding that worth is not conditional, that being alive is reason enough to stay. That even after everything has been lost, something essential can still be found. For anyone listening who feels trapped in exhaustion, who believes they must keep running or risk disappearing, her story offers a quiet counterpoint. You do not have to disappear to rest. You do not have to be loved to exist. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stay, breathe, and refuse to give up on yourself, even when no one is watching. This is not the end of her story. It is simply the moment where she stopped living for an audience and began living for herself. And in that choice, there's a kind of peace that does not need to be explained, defended, or shared. It simply is.